So this is really a supplement to Genesis chapter 9. And the reason I'm including this here is that the ancient Jewish sages read between the lines of Genesis 9, and they determined that there were 7 general laws that, in their opinion, are self-evident and binding on all humanity, whether you're Jewish or not, and specifically they're binding on non-Jews. So they refer to these laws as the Noachide laws, or we might just say Noahide laws. We're not using the Hebrew sound. So in this video, I want to take a look at what those laws are and really place them in the context of the Acts 15 council. So you may or may not be aware that as Gentiles were coming to faith in Jesus, it was initially an entirely Jewish faith. So then the question is, okay, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles? Are we going to force them to become Jews, or if not, where the boundaries are? Well, come to find out that they drew a lot from these Noahide laws, as well as some provisions in the Torah that talk about this area in between being a full Gentile and being a full legal Jew. And so I kind of want to look at that and probe that a little bit in this video. So I hope you find it interesting. First thing we need to start with, and there'll just be a lot of terms we just need to get familiar with. The Torah describes actually 3 classes of people. We often think of just 2, right? Jews and Gentiles. There's actually a third class. So the first class is the B'nai Yisrael. Those are the natural-born Jews. That's Hebrew for the sons of Israel. That includes Gentile proselytes who went through full legal conversion to become basically full legal Jews. So this group would be required to keep the full Torah, the full assortment of what came to be known as 613 mitzvot, 613 commands. There's another category called Ger Toshav, and that loosely translated means resident alien. These are often referred to as righteous Gentiles. And so these are Gentiles who, they are not in the first category. They didn't fully proselytize to become Jews, but they did attach themselves to the God of Israel and the people of Israel. And we'll learn that they were required to keep the Noahide laws as well as certain portions of the Torah. And that actually has a direct significance to Acts 15, which I'll kind of unpack as we move through this. And then the third category we're probably more familiar with is the Goyim, the nations. Usually the implication there is the unbelieving Gentile nations. Now, they were required to keep the Noahide laws because in the sages' view, these laws were self-evident. And whether you knew about the God of Israel or not, you should have known to keep these laws. Paul actually talks about something very similar in Romans chapter 1. Go ahead and read that. We'll say that for a different discussion. But there's certain parts of nature that just speak about God and that everyone, regardless of what your faith background is, you should be familiar with. Now, of course, the Goyim are wicked. They largely did not keep these laws, and in the Jewish mind, this actually further cements their guilt and their wickedness in the eyes of God. So let's try and set the scene for what led up to this Acts 15 council and this decision. So as the early church went forth from the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, all of the early believers were Jewish. This was a Jewish faith in a Jewish Messiah. Everyone coming to faith was really, they didn't view themselves as changing faiths or converting. They were just complementing. Messiah complemented and completed their faith. And so they all approached this from a common Jewish perspective that they had all had ever since they were kids. They grew up learning the Torah, and it just naturally fit that their Messiah is now here. So again, not really converting to a new faith. But as the church grew, eventually these Gentiles started to come to faith. That did not have any Jewish frame of reference. They truly did convert. They were leaving paganism and coming to this faith in the Jewish Messiah. And then they started fellowshipping alongside of their believing Jewish counterpart. They worshiped together. They shared meals together. Paul notes in Romans 10 and 11 that Gentile believers were to be considered spiritual sons of Abraham. So no one was doubting that they were saved, as we think of the term. But practically, we need to think about how this side-by-side living created a bit of a difficulty. Well, you're saved, but you're not Jewish. How is that How is that? That just seems like an impossibility. So, in fact, those advocating that Gentiles should become full Jews were trying to practically solve a problem, right? I think they did so because they wanted to eliminate this tension that was being caused by these believers living so closely in the Jewish space. So this was a really practical solution. However, as we just looked at, if you only have Jews and converted Jews as believers and then the Gentiles as non-believers, that view is actually not supported by the Torah for the fact that we just saw, right? The Torah clearly provides three classes of people: Jews, believing Gentiles, and non-believing Gentiles, the Goyim. According to the Torah, proselytization should be voluntary. So another problem is you can't force someone to convert to Judaism. Judaism is actually not an evangelistic religion. They welcome proselytes, but they don't go out and evangelize and force people. That's just their viewpoint. So forced conversions have been done throughout history. It just hasn't worked out very well, and God never sanctioned this anywhere in the Torah. So from this perspective, it will be inconsistent for the early church to have said, yes, you need to be Jewish, and then to force conversions. Also, you've got this problem where you've got adult converts that all of a sudden need to take on the full weight of Torah, which is something that the natural-born Jews have studied since childhood, but yet the adult converts are coming to it fresh. So they would have been pretty lost and probably pretty frustrating. The other side, as we mentioned, is that Moses did allow for this category of ger teshav. So inconsistent for Moses to allow it and the early church not to allow this middle category. So yet there had to be some distinction between the ger teshav. So I think the real question is, what does the ger teshav mean in this messianic movement? How are they going to be distinguished from the goyim, the pagan Romans who did not believe in Messiah? And I believe these are the questions that are presented to the Acts 15 council. So to get our feet wet, let's go ahead and read this decision in Acts 15. And I'll start with verse 12. There's a whole backstory that I encourage you to read, but we'll start with verse 12. And the assembly fell silent. They listened to Barnabas and Paul as they related the signs and wonders God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they finished speaking, James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it was written, I will return, I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen, I will rebuild its ruins, I will restore it, that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, and the Gentiles who are called by my name, who makes these things known, says the Lord, who makes these things known from old." So again, we've got this category of believing Gentiles. "Therefore, my judgment is we should not trouble these Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols," number one, "from sexual immorality," command number 2, "from what has been strangled," command number 3, and "from blood," which is command number 4. And then they conclude by saying, "For from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues." So as we move through the rest of this little talk, I want us to be asking a series of questions. Why these 4 prohibitions? And then why only these 4? Why were others not mentioned? So you're telling me that we can go out and murder and we can go out and do other things, but as long as we don't eat food strangled, then we're okay? What exactly is going on here? Of course, the answer to that is no. Did the apostles view these as the only laws that would ever be binding on Gentiles? Or was this more of a starting place? In other words, was this the definitive statement on Gentile behavior or something else? Why does a passage about Gentiles conclude with a statement about a very Jewish Moses being read in every Jewish Sabbath in the Jewish synagogues? So kind of how does that tie in? And I think the answer to these questions lie in understanding the background of these Noachide laws. So let's go ahead and start digging into those. Now, the sages, again, read between the lines, and they came up with some other laws. all drawn from other parts of the Bible. In the sage's opinion, again, these laws were self-evident and binding on all humanity, whether you were a follower of the Jewish God or not. And then as history unfolds, the Hebrews will later be held to an even higher standard. And then again, there's that middle category that the Torah will talk about as well, and we'll look at some of those verses. So as we review this list, let's keep in mind Jesus' statement that he came to fulfill and not abolish the Jewish Torah, as well as the 4 prohibitions given to the early Gentile believers in Acts 15. So all of this will tie together. The 7 laws are the laws of Noah, are do not worship idols or other gods, do not blaspheme or curse God's name, do not murder or participate in bloodshed, do not engage in illicit sexuality, do not rob, establish courts of justice, and then do not eat flesh from a living animal. And you'll see these lists in different orders. The wording is slightly different, but essentially this is the list. So let's go unpack these one by one, and we'll look at some connecting verses and why some of these weren't stated to the early church and why some of them had to be clarified. So the first law we'll look at, do not worship idols or other gods. And they drew this by the fact that God spoke directly to Job, Noah, and Adam, and others who were not Jews, right? They were pre-Abraham. So Abraham was the first Jew, so anyone before Abraham was not a Jew. The sages then viewed monotheism as self-evident, meaning everyone, at least in the ancient Near East world, should have known these things. This prohibits worshiping any created thing. This prohibits creating any object for the purpose of veneration. Prohibits all of the occult arts, magic, sorcery, and all of that. And basically what goes on to be described in the Torah are all of these things. And so, in other words, as Lancaster says, the Torah's numerous laws that deal with idolatry pertain to the Gentiles. So what's binding on the Jews and what's binding on Gentiles is exactly the same. So as we go through, I'll mark certain of these laws with asterisks, and that just indicates that in the way I'm reading it, the apostles of the early church figured these were self-evident. And so you'll see that these are not restated by the Acts 15 council, probably because everyone should have known these rules and they were self-evident. So we don't need to restate something that people were already doing. With idols, there is a problem that will arise with meat sacrificed to idols that we'll get to when we tackle the last commandment. But all these people were coming out of idolatry, so they knew right away what they were leaving behind and what God required. The Acts 15 church council did not need to restate this one. The next one is do not blaspheme or curse God's name. So the sages take this one not really from Genesis, but from the story of Job, who also was not Jewish. He was probably during the time of Abraham. Job and his bad counsel from his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But Job said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. So from this also comes the Jewish custom to even speak a blessing when one hears bad news. So that they will do that because we're supposed to take the good with the bad. So this law includes all of the prohibitions on making false oaths, swearing falsely in the name of the Lord, or taking the Lord's name in vain, which we see is codified in one of the 10 Commandments. So it seems here too, the Torah's laws on blasphemy apply equally to Gentiles. And so we'll mark this second law as self-evident. It would not have been necessary to repeat this law for new believers in Jesus. Now, in their idolatrous world, this would have made sense because to speak poorly of a deity was to invite that deity's wrath. So while not exactly the same, the same general mindset would have transferred over to their new belief in Jesus and God the Father. You just would not blaspheme or curse their name. It would have been self-evident and not necessary to repeat it. Do not murder or participate in bloodshed. And again, this is another self-evident command. Almost every civilization that has ever existed condemns murder. They tend to have different definitions of what constitutes murder, as does our society, by the way. Killing of certain people is not considered murder, and we'll save that for a different discussion. But at a basic level, Judaism and Western societies do draw a distinction between murder and killing accidentally without any intent. We call that manslaughter. If you kill in self-defense, if you kill in war, or if you're carrying out a capital punishment, none of those are murder. So murder implies a criminal intent to take another's life. And it's interesting that before the flood, God allowed Cain to live, even though he had committed murder. And then we correlate this to the thorough wickedness of Cain's line. So it was, God showing mercy, and kind of that backfired by Cain's line, but we don't know. But anyway, in any case, now in Genesis 9, God is prescribing the death penalty for murder. Now, included with the prohibition not to murder would include conspiracy to commit murder. One who does this is just as guilty, even if someone else does the deed. And we think of David for that one. David had Uriah put in the front lines intentionally so that he would be killed. So David was guilty, just as guilty of murder, just as if he had pulled the trigger himself. Suicide is also in this category of do not murder. So perhaps an area where the Torah goes further than what Gentiles were expected to do. A Jew who is able to prevent the death of another and fails to do so transgressions the prohibition against murder. So again, if you're in a position to prevent a murder but you do not, then you are just as guilty of murder. Jews also provided cities of refuge where an assailant could claim manslaughter, and that was an avenue not available to Gentiles. Jewish law also has laws against evil speech and character assassination, which the Torah equates with murder. Leviticus 19:16, you shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. And this is interesting because Jesus affirms this in Matthew 5. You have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. So if you're angry, Jesus is saying, hey, that is the same as murder. So Jesus has a very high bar here for believers in him with respect to murder. In summary, though, non-Gentile believers may have a slightly lower standard for murder than what the Torah prescribes, but followers of Jesus now have the same expectations as the intent of the Torah regarding murder. So again, murder in general is self-evident, so we'll mark this one with an asterisk too. Gentile believers would not have needed to be reminded, now your former religion permitted murder, but ours doesn't. So therefore the Acts 15 council did not need to list do not murder as a command to the church. The next one, though, does require some clarification. Do not engage in illicit sexuality. I think this needs constant clarification and reminding today, as many believers are apparently unaware of what God's standards regarding sexual purification are. So the sages derive this command from Genesis 2, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then the repeated commands, be fruitful and multiply. So the sages viewed fornication and all other forms of sexual immorality as really the antithesis of this command, going against this command. And so any union outside of a man and a wife is forbidden and considered immoral. With that being said, mankind and our sinful desires always want to define this as narrowly as possible. Well, if I do this, then I'm not really violating the law. That's just not true. The sages are clear that sexual relations with anyone other than one's spouse are forbidden. And then this applies to all Gentiles by virtue of the command coming in Genesis 2. Many of the ancient cultures, as does our culture today, likes to redefine what is and what is not sexually immoral. So if one went into a temple prostitute and committed an act there, that was okay because that was an act of worship, and you wanted the gods to bless the fertility of your crops, so you acted out an act of fertility, and that was called worship. That wasn't immoral. And so in Greek and Roman times, this later morphed into just sex acts for general blessing, and so this was the world that the Gentile converts were emerging from. So to all of this, the Torah said absolutely not. Sex was to be between a man and his wife, just as it was decreed in Genesis. All other unions were forbidden. So according to Acts 15, verse 20, the apostles affirmed the Torah's definition and standards of sexual immorality. They also apply to all Gentile followers of Jesus. And they're drawing this authority from Leviticus 18:26. And I want you to notice carefully what it says. But you shall keep my statutes and rules and do none of these sexual abominations. So the whole preceding chapter had to deal with sexual forbidden unions. either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. So even back in the Torah days, this law regarding sexual purity was binding on both Jews and believing Gentiles. And then the Acts 15 council is saying essentially the same thing. For Jewish believers in Messiah and Gentile believers in Messiah, we're holding you to hold to the Torah's standards of sexual purity. So this is a photo from a brothel discovered in Pompeii, and it has very graphic inscriptions. And as Dr. Bolin writes, it provides an illustration of the degraded practices of the Roman world that new Gentile believers would be coming from. So we're going to mark this one in gold, not with an asterisk, because this one truly needed clarification and redefining for new believers that were exiting this pagan world. Sexual immorality was rampant in the Greco-Roman world, and church leaders made it clear that non-Jewish followers of Messiah could have no part in such activities. And that's a quote from Dr. Bolin. The next one, do not rob. That includes dishonest dealings and robbery. And all of these were factors that brought on the flood, if we think about it, this dishonest practices. Theft of personal property, kidnapping, swindling, fraud, extortion, dishonesty, overcharging, using unjust weights, moving boundary stones, encroaching on another's livelihood, paying dishonest wages. All of these kind of fall into this general category of do not rob. Basically, any act that takes advantage of someone else, whether or not a financial loss was incurred, was considered to have gone against this commandment. So the non-believing Gentile world may have had different definitions of theft, but as we are seeing, Gentile believers in Jesus have to follow the Torah's standards for ethical conduct and behavior. So we'll mark do not rob with an asterisk, signifying that it was globally understood and did not need to be repeated by the Acts 15 council. It was just something that they should have known and should have been self-evident. Now, with that said, as we grow in Christ, our level of ethics should grow as well. Paul will touch on these themes in many of his letters. The sixth one, established courts of justice, is from Genesis 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. We looked at that on the verse-by-verse passage. So with respect to this being bound on all Gentiles, the sages viewed it as implying that trials for capital crimes would be done in a lawful, fair, and just manner, and not just revenge or vigilantism. So, again, here, the Torah's many laws of justice, legal procedure, litigation, tort law, fines, penalties, all of that applies universally to all human beings. So this is more of a national command than an individual one, but still, the general concept of doing justly, practicing justice was understood, and the Acts 15 council did not see the need to restate this one. And now we really get to the big bugaboo, the Jewish dietary restrictions. This question will permeate not only the remainder of Acts, but throughout the New Testament, Paul's letters, and we'll even see it flows into the book of Revelation, this thought of eating dietary pure food, and we'll look at a verse from Revelation later. So generally, this law in Genesis 9 referred to eating animals that are still alive. Do not eat flesh from a living animal. Now, thankfully, our modern 21st century standards, this is actually quite repulsive to consider, but apparently it was a deal back then. Regarding dietary purity, though, we have a clear difference between the Jewish dietary laws and those of the Gentile world, and we see those today. That's probably the biggest difference in they will never eat a dairy product in conjunction with a meat product. They're very much more limited as to the meat that they can consume versus the Gentile world, and so it's a big distinction between Jews and Gentiles. Deuteronomy 14 says something interesting. If a Jew comes across an animal that has died of itself, the Jew may not eat it because it wasn't slaughtered in a kosher manner, but it says he may give it to a Gentile to eat. So again, God is drawing a distinction between what a Jew can eat and what Gentiles can eat. I like to throw out here that we tend to think of food as just being clean and unclean, but there's actually three categories, just as there are for Jewish people. We have clean food, which are clean animals approved by the Torah, and those animals are sacrificed and prepared in a kosher manner according to the Torah. Then we have unclean food, which are clean animals. So unclean food is clean animals approved, but not sacrificed or prepared. So if you have a cow that you slaughter in a kosher manner, you can, and prepared kosherly, you can eat the cow. If a cow is, shot in the head or is found dead, then that is unclean food. A Jew should not eat that. Then there's this third category that we often think of as unclean food, but it's actually not food at all. Any unclean animal not approved by the Torah for food is unclean food. So in other words, unclean animals are not unclean food. Unclean animals are not food at all. So we need to kind of keep that in mind as we look through the food-based arguments that Paul is making. There's food, and there's unclean food, and then there's not food. Now let's look at these 3 dietary prohibitions, and these are summarized in Acts 15:29. You abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well, fare well. And so this first command, things sacrificed to idols, we're going to see that the apostles drew from the Torah how they base these commands to give to the new Gentile believers. And so let's look at these passages and how the Torah says they apply not only to the house of Israel, but to the strangers who sojourn among you. And that's going to be key because the new Gentiles are going to be equated as strangers who sojourn among Israel. And that's a very clear, once you look at it, it's a very clear designation. So in this case, the apostles drew from Leviticus 17, 7 through 9. So they shall no more sacrifices their sacrifices to goat demons after whom they whore. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout the generations, and you shall say to them, any one of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt sacrifice or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people. So this is very different from the general prohibition on idolatry, which we already looked at. This is about food sacrificed to idols. And so basically what the council is saying to the Gentiles is that there needs to be a heightened distancing from idolatry based on the Torah's prohibitions. So these apply not only to the house of Israel, but also to the strangers. So we have to remember everything in the Roman Empire was sacrificed to idols. Jews were allowed to, for the most part, keep their own religion, but Gentiles would have not had this exemption. We talked about this a lot in the early chapters of Revelation. So this restriction actually would have been a major hardship for Gentile believers. This picture shows a man bringing offerings to an altar. So basically everything in the Roman marketplace would have been sacrificed to an idol or offered to an idol, a portion thereof. And so this would have been very difficult for the early church, and yet the apostles are saying, no, you've got to do this. This is important. The next prohibition is that you abstain from blood. And the apostles draw this from Leviticus 17, verses 10 and 11. If any of you among the house of Israel or the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by life. So again, so when we think about from abstaining from blood, it's not talking about murder. Murder was self-evident. This really comes from the fact that in other cultures, it was okay to drink blood, and in some pagan rituals, things involving blood had emerged. So, for example, the Egyptians had no issue with drinking blood of animals. This slide shows a model slaughterhouse where they are collecting blood from butchered cattle to be made into blood pudding. So really the apostles are saying Gentile converts are to have no part of any of this. Basically, Gentiles converts have to hold to the same standards as Jews. And again, the phrase in Leviticus keeps recurring, the house of Israel or the strangers who sojourn among them. And then the final dietary restriction is on things strangled. And again, drawing from Leviticus 17, therefore I've said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, and neither shall any stranger who sojourns among you shall eat blood. Any one of the people of Israel or of the stranger who sojourn among them, who takes in hunting any beast or bird that may be eaten, shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For the life of the creature is the blood is its life. Therefore I have said to the people, you shall not eat the blood of the creature. Life of the creature is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. So this is interpreted to mean you've got to have a kosher form of slaughter, which just so you're aware involves cutting the main artery of the neck, which actually is painless for the animal, and the animal just sort of bleeds out silently. So in other words, Gentile believers should only be eating food that has been slaughtered and the blood drained properly. And again, we could call this kosher slaughter, but I have to make the caveat that modern kosher standards are much stricter than what we find outlined in the Torah, just based on tradition. Dr. Bolin notes here that possibly the Gentile believers are told to keep this law in order to avoid offending their Jewish brothers. But in either case, it was determined to be a law that the Gentiles had to follow. So for the final Noachide law, we see that this is the one that required the most clarification with respect to new Gentile believers. And really, the food prohibitions are very close to the full allotment of the Torah's dietary laws. Some say the council was actually imposing the full standards. However, there's a late first century document called the Didache, that contained instructions for new Gentile believers, and it has this note at Didache chapter 6 verse 3 concerning the food laws, or the Jewish food laws: do as much as you are able. So this would imply that they are not under the full body of restrictions, but they should be working to incorporate more and more of the Torah as they mature. So other than insisting we have freedom in Christ to eat pork and shrimp, we probably don't give a lot of thought to what we eat with respect to what the Bible says we should and shouldn't eat. And yet look how important this issue was to the early church. And this debate actually continued throughout the first century, and actually wasn't settled by the time we get to Revelation. Jesus had to remind a few churches of his expectations regarding clean eating. And so we see, I have a few things against you. There are those who hold the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. And just a comment, are those two topics linked somehow? Eating food sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality. They do appear to be. So to recap, we can see that most of the Noachide laws are truly things that should be understood by all cultures, at least all cultures that have their roots in what we might call the ancient world of Europe, Northern Africa, and then the Near East of Asia. We can see that the Acts Council felt no need to comment on 5 of the 7. They were self-evident, and those are the ones I have marked with asterisks there. Now, the 4 requirements of Acts 15 appear to be elaborations on the other 2 Noachide laws, so there's a definite connection here. The existence of the laws of Noah explain why the apostles felt no need to write out a new set of rules for the Gentiles, and I'm quoting Daniel Lancaster, or to spell out the obvious moral and ethical statutes of Judaism, such as prohibitions on murder, theft, idolatry, etc. All of these laws applied already to human beings. And so basically it was those things that had become corrupted even further: illicit sexuality, eat flesh from a living animal. Those needed further clarification. And that's how we end up with the 4 prohibitions in Acts 15. So I think we can learn a lot from this study, because the early church considered the first Gentile believers to be in a different class, that third middle class of people. And I think the same is true for us today. We are to be different from the rest of the world. We are more than simply sons of Noah. We are sons of Jesus, our Messiah. And in general, as we mature as believers, we want to become more and more like Jesus. And this may mean our former ways will no longer feel right to us, and we will find ourselves moving closer to what the Jewish standards were. But for now, we are not called to be full Jews. We don't need to be, and yet we do need to be set apart from the Gentile world around us. The new believers were to continue to meet weekly in Jewish synagogues and study Torah. And so we see that in Acts 15:21. And so I asked the question in the beginning, why does a passage on Gentiles conclude with the fact that they met every week in the synagogues. And I believe that the expectation they were communicating was that these 4 prohibitions were only to be a starting point. As they met in the synagogues and as they continued to learn more about Messiah and fellowship more with the Jews around him, they would be expected to grow in maturity and gradually take on more of the Torah's laws, again, as a thank you to the God who saved them. And then we should be doing this too. We can apply the Didache's words to just about any aspect of our behavior as we mature. Do as much as you are able. So as we grow in Christ, we want to become more like him. And then note one thing, that the believers, the Gentile believers, were saved and then they were given these laws. So it's not like we do these laws to be saved. We do these laws because we are saved, as a way to identify as his and be set apart. In John 15, Jesus makes a command, bear good fruit so that you will know that you are my disciples. And so that is what we're all about here. We want to be set apart from the world. So I hope this little study helped, and we will see you next time for Genesis chapter 10 and 11.
We hope you've enjoyed this lesson. For more information, find us on the web, www.talmudimway.org.